If you've been watching my videos recently, you may recall one where I trimmed two large, more sculptural bowls with ledges on the inside and with a sharp, angular exterior. This week's video is the conclusion to that, although if you haven't seen the first part, I'll leave a link to that on screen now and in the description to this video. And we'll pick the process up when the two more decorative bowls are bone dry and are being packed into the electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. This process hardens the stoneware, and it means that the pots can be handled much more easily, as during the bone dry state they are exceedingly fragile, and one small knock would be enough to chip or crack the piece. As this firing only goes to 1000 degrees, the pots can touch, and they can be laid on their side, all without running the risk that the pieces might stick or warp and distort. 2 days later, once the kiln has cooled down, all of these pots can be unpacked from the kiln, a process that's much easier now that the pots have gained some strength. And together with this added strength, the pieces have also shrunk slightly and they've changed colour. But most importantly, they're now porous, like a sponge almost, and if I were to pour water into this bowl, much of it would be absorbed by the stoneware. The next step is to brush a layer of wax emulsion over the base. This creates a protective layer which will prevent the glaze from adhering to this part of the pot. If I did leave the underside glazed, when I fired it in the kiln, the glaze would melt and fuse the pot to the kiln shelf, which would mean both damaging the pot itself, as it would have to be removed with a hammer, or it could even break the expensive kiln shelf too, which is even worse. So by masking the feet like this, it should make tidying up the pot after it's been glazed far more straightforward. Now, glazing these pots was another challenge in itself, as I wasn't sure what the best route would be to get a nice even application both inside and out. And I'm warning you, I don't do the best job of this, but I did somehow get away with it, like you'll see at the end of this video, when these pots are reduction fired in my gas kiln. By dipping the outside only, I was able to get a very even, clean application on the exterior. I of course didn't mean for this glaze to run over the edge, so I quickly clean it up with a sponge, and then tomorrow, once this pot is dried out, I'll glaze the inside of the bowl. Now you may be thinking, why don't I just glaze the whole thing held with tongs, like I do with my smaller mugs and bowls? Well, there comes a point when a pot is quite heavy and the vessel is trimmed relatively thinly, where the tongs feel as if they might pierce or snap certain sections of the pot, and you need to be careful about how the glaze is poured out of the form after it's been submerged, as if you let that weight sit in the bowl and you hold the pot with tongs in an awkward manner, then it's very easy for things to go wrong. So I prefer to take the method that's slightly safer and simply glaze the outside and then the inside. You can see how the glaze on the outside is now fully dried, as it's become a much lighter pink colour. This also means that the walls of the pot are no longer saturated with water, so when I pour glaze inside, the walls themselves are drawing in a nice thick layer of glaze, which they may not have done if I tried to glaze the insides of these pots straight away. Now, my execution pouring the glaze out wasn't the best either, and although I should be able to clean up the glaze that's overflowed quite easily, doing so will add a lot of time to the making process of these. And so the next time I make and glaze something like this, I'll definitely either glaze them the other way around, first the inside and then the outside, or I'll glaze the outside first and then apply a thin layer of wax just underneath the rim on the outside over the glaze. This way, when I pour the glaze out, it won't have anything to cling onto as it flows out. Either way, despite my messy glazing, I should be able to clean all of this up without it having any real impact on the final appearance of the pot, but I'm going to have to be very thorough in my cleanup. This is now a few days later, and the glaze has dried out fully, leaving a very soft, powdery layer that's easy to tidy up. So in theory, all I need do is wipe back those areas that are a bit thick until they match the correct thickness of the glaze that's applied to the rest of the pot. This is slow and careful work, as I also don't want to accidentally wipe away the glaze too much, as otherwise I'll be left with a thin spot, which in some cases can look even worse than a thick spot. The really thick parts though have to be removed, as if left, the glaze could crawl on these sections. This is when the glaze begins to separate from itself, leaving small, irregular patches of bare clay. Crawling ruins my work, as it makes what's meant to be a very uniform and neat surface look like anything but that. And so I just use a sharp metal edge like this to gradually carve away the excess glaze, and once it's been fettled back to the correct thickness, I can rub over these areas with my fingertips to make sure the surface is flush and smooth. There's no rushing this process, and tidying up the glaze on both of these probably took about 40 minutes all in all. Tidying up the underside is slightly trickier though, so I place a thick wodge of foam inside the bowl and then I place it very carefully upside down onto a container. I then use a flat edge tool just to lightly scrape over the surface to make sure it's even. Then I can start cleaning the foot itself, which, despite it being waxed, for some reason it took on a lot more glaze than the waxed portions of my pots normally do. Maybe it has something to do about how the bowl was pushed into the glaze. Either way, I had to spend quite a lot of time scrubbing all the glaze off. But with this part clean, one of the bowls is finished. The second one had a more severe drip on the outside, and when I scrape over these, I really try to remove just a little bit of glaze at a time. I want it to come off layer by layer, rather than trying to pry off one big chunk all at once. As in the past when I've done that, it often leads to more glaze being removed than I'd like. I did have to dab some glaze onto a few areas where the glaze chipped off. In these cases, I tend to cover it with slightly more than need be, and then once it's dry, I rub back over these areas with a fingertip or the sharp metal edge and make it flush with the rest of the surface. It's worth mentioning though that fixing glazes like this does not work for every kind of glaze. Some will show these marks even if you fix them very carefully, whereas others, like this particular recipe, is quite forgiving and you can touch up areas like this if they've been damaged. As the underside was dipped all at once, it doesn't require much tidying up, and I simply scrub over a few specks where the glaze was slightly raised. The bowl is then flipped, upside down, and although out of shot, there is a thick layer of foam between the plastic and the glazed surface, as otherwise that sharp plastic edge would definitely dig into the glaze. And with the two bowls finally finished, I can pack them into my Rohde KG340 gas kiln so they can be reduction fired to 1290 degrees Celsius. This kiln is loaded from the front, compared to my electric kiln which is a top loader. I prefer to pack front-loading kilns like this, although as the shelves go up it can be a little bit more difficult to see what you're doing, as you can't easily see behind the pots you're placing inside, but you learn to pack despite that. After each layer has been densely filled, two more shelves are placed in, atop props, and another layer of pots can be packed in. For this second glaze firing, which goes to a much hotter temperature, the pieces cannot touch, otherwise they'll fuse together. Yet it helps, when reduction firing, to pack as densely as possible, so there's as little space for oxygen to occupy, as ultimately during the firing we'll be trying to starve the kiln of oxygen. And if I pack the kiln and leave lots of empty space, then that space oxygen can easily fill, and I'll then have a much more difficult time achieving a successful reduction atmosphere. And if the reduction is unsuccessful, then none of my pots will fire like I want them to. And with the kiln packed, I can come in early the following morning to light and fire it. This process takes about 9 hours from beginning to end, and unlike my electric kiln which fires automatically, this kiln is controlled entirely by hand, by increasing or decreasing the gas pressure, controlling the air pressure, and altering the damper's position, which covers the flue of the kiln. The kiln is lit with the door open, which prevents any gas accumulating inside, which is suddenly ignited. The door is then tightly sealed, and the temperature is gradually increased, slowly at the start, as if you increase the temperature too rapidly, it might actually cause pots to explode. As I fire the kiln, I continually take notes. This way, when I have a successful firing, I can simply copy it by increasing the gas and air and changing the damper position in the exact same way I previously did. I do this for every firing, and whilst all this data might make reduction firing seem quite complicated, it really is relatively straightforward. It's just a process that seems rather intimidating as you're dealing with gas, as opposed to electricity. But as long as you follow the firing rules and are careful and attentive, then I can easily fire this kiln whilst doing lots of other jobs throughout the day. At exactly 860 degrees Celsius, reduction is initiated, and then once cone 10 is flat, at about 1290 degrees Celsius, the kiln can be switched off and the firing concluded. From this point, the kiln will take about 2 days to cool down, before the door can finally be opened. And here's the first of those 2 bowls, and seriously, to my utter shock, even with all that faffing around with the glaze, they fired perfectly, which I honestly didn't expect to happen. Once all the pots have been unpacked, I can begin dealing with the bases of these pots. They don't require much attention, I just very lightly sand the stoneware with a splash of water dropped over the bottom. I don't want to sand them too much, as otherwise I risk removing the toasted colour given to the stoneware by the kiln, so I polish the bases just enough to remove any coarse specks of sand that could otherwise scratch a tabletop or a shelf, depending on where this pot is placed. And here they are, the finished objects. The metallic brown tone around the rim is caused by the glaze flowing away from that sharp edge around the top, revealing the iron-rich clay body underneath. But I adore how the glaze has moved over these ledges on the outside, and how the glaze has come to a stop in a thick band around the base. More than anything though, I'm simply surprised by how uniform the surface looks, considering all the drips and drabs it had. So it's safe to say that I'm really happy with these, and it's really inspired me to take this idea further, to create larger, taller bowls with ledges and lips and sharp angles. They don't inherently feel as if they're functional objects. Rather, they're something a bit more sculptural, and I can't wait to make more. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. Let me know what you think of these pots, and as always, I'll see you next week.